Thank you everyone for attending today. Appreciate not only the Southland members for joining, but we have folks from all over the state. We're excited today to have Madeline Drake with California Natural Resources Agency. She's the Assistant Secretary of Biodiversity and Habitat, and she has quite a skill set. So when she was appointed, the press release included quite a few notable positions, including California Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, California Department of Parks and Recreation, and on top of that, a degree from University of California, Davis in animal biology. So you clearly have the experience to help us meet 30 by 30, and we're appreciative that you're with us today. So what we have in store is a presentation on pathways to 30 by 30. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Madeline, who's going to do a PowerPoint, and then we'll pause at the end. We have some questions that were submitted in advance. We may have questions available at the end, or time rather, for those questions. So go ahead and drop them in the chat and we'll be watching that as well. So Madeline, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Melanie. Let me share the screen. Can you see it okay?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. So thank you so much for the introduction, Melanie. I want to give a quick shout out to Melanie, who is on our 30 by 30 Partnership Coordinating Committee. We're very lucky to have her, and she is an amazing ambassador for you all and telling us about the great work you all are doing. So happy to be here and talk with you all. I am quickly going to start with an overview of how we got to where we are. I think most of you all will know this information, but at least we'll all be on the same page and can kind of give you some statistics and stuff you might not have been able to kind of pull out on your own from all the different various resources. And then I really want to jump into kind of implementation of pathways, where we're at, and some exciting things to come, give a little preview. So without further ado, let me go. All right. So hopefully you all know that our 30 by 30 goal all started with the executive order in 8220 from the Newsom administration, and this happened in October of 2020. So broadly, this executive order is to expand nature-based solutions to achieve California's climate change and biodiversity goals. So there's quite a few things in this executive order, but really importantly, it commits the state to conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. So this is where that initial commitment was made. So if you've ever thought, well, why 30% and why by 2030? This is actually an international movement, and scientists from all over the world have come together to say, you know, if we can conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030, then we have a fighting chance against the biodiversity and climate crises that we're dealing with. And there's been quite a lot of literature to back up those numbers, to really say, you know, this is to give us hope. And if we can all come together for this goal, us as a globe might have hope. And so at this point, over 100 countries have signed on to this 30 by 30 goal. But California, we're a large state. We have one of the leading economies in the world. So it's important to us as sort of a subnational to come together and say, we're committed to this goal and we're going to get it done. So after the executive order is sort of when we really kind of needed to figure out how are we going to get this done. And that executive order included, you will write a strategy for how we're going to achieve 30 by 30. And they tasked the California Natural Resources Agency with that. And that's really where I came into this. So I was very lucky to lead the team that wrote the Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy document. I had 4 incredibly talented, amazing scientists on my team to kind of help me get started with this and really jump into a strategy document. But before we ever put pens to paper, we knew that public input was going to be extremely important. Even though I had incredibly talented, amazing scientists, there's so many incredibly talented, amazing people in the state. And so it was really important that everybody had buy-in and everyone could see themselves in this strategy, because that's the only way we're really going to accomplish our goal. So again, before we ever put pens to paper, we knew that we needed to have a public input process. So initially, from the very beginning, the California Natural Resources Agency started with tribal consultation and listening sessions to really make sure that we're appropriately partnering with our California Native American tribes. We also held 9 regional workshops throughout the state, and we were lucky to have 2,500 people participate in these. And they were sort of, I hope many of you participated, these sort of quick, almost like tweet-like answers. And we ended up with 10,000 responses. And I assure you that my team read every single one of those. And there's such great sound bites to kind of keep in mind, like what is our goal and what do people really want in their sort of local communities out of 30 by 30. We also had an online survey, and we had 950 people. The sort of map on the bottom left hand of the screen with the pins in it, those are people that participated in the survey. And so really a good across the state, but you can see some sort of clusters in our bigger cities. So we're really lucky to get feedback, and that just allowed people to provide sort of longer information or really specific letters or data that they could share with us before we got started with our strategy. And then finally, we held 5 topical advisory panels where we worked to put together sort of key questions that we needed help answering from experts before we started our strategy document. And that included a panel on climate, equity, biodiversity, conservation of lands, and conservation of coastal waters. And so these questions, I do want to say that we not only gave them to the experts to answer, but we also we released them out before we ever had any sort of public workshop or anything like that, because we wanted everybody to be able to sort of answer and give their input on the particular questions related to these specific topics. So, we had our expert panel write us a white paper, but then we opened up our lines to anybody who wanted to come, and they could talk at the meeting, or they could provide letters specific to these topics. So we got a lot of really great input right off the bat before we ever put pens to paper. Then we sat down, took it all in, tried to come up with, a draft that we felt like was really representative of all the input that we heard. And that draft came out in the fall of 2021. That's when it sort of was first released. And after that draft came out, we wanted to continue to get input because, our first try is not going to be perfect. And so we wanted to hear from everybody. So we continued to have tribal listening sessions and consultations. We received over 1,000 letters specific to our document that sort of about 4,000 individuals, whether they sort of did a group letter or whether they maybe just provided a few sort of comments that weren't a full letter, but we heard from over 400 individuals. We had an advisory committee where sort of we had leaders from across the state sit down in a public forum to discuss the document. And then finally, we had a public meeting where if people didn't want to provide feedback through sort of written forms, they could come and they could sort of talk about their input on the draft. We opened up sort of like an open mic. And this all was mostly virtual because of the pandemic. And so that does limit us a little bit, but it did allow for us to reach a lot of people throughout the state, which was really nice. I'm here in Sacramento, but I felt like I got to learn so much about different parts of the state than I would otherwise. So very grateful for that opportunity. So finally, we took all that feedback that we heard and we released our final Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy document in April of 2022. And I'm going to kind of go over sort of high level of what's in this document and then kind of get into implementation and what that means as we're moving forward. So there are 3 main objectives to our conservation framework, and that is to protect and restore biodiversity, to expand access to nature, and to mitigate and build resilience to climate change. So these are 3 key objectives that we're thinking about when we're thinking about conservation within 30 by 30 and what we're trying to achieve, really to sort of get at that biodiversity and climate crises, but also recognizing that we have the opportunity to expand access and really meet that sort of human dimension of getting people out to nature. We also have 3 core commitments or things that we're thinking about throughout all the conservation that we're doing for 30 by 30. And we really want to make sure that these commitments are sort of at the top of our minds and included when we're thinking about conservation. So that is to advance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, to strengthen tribal partnerships, and protect our economic prosperity, clean energy resources, and food supplies. So these commitments are things that we want to be thinking about, again, top of mind when we're considering conservation. So the definition of conservation, or what we define as 30 by 30 conservation areas, that was a very difficult process to sort of come up with, and we received so much great input. And where we landed was land and coastal water areas that are durably protected and managed to sustain functional ecosystems, both intact and restored, and the diversity of life that they support. That's sort of our conceptual definition and what we mean by conservation in the context of 30 by 30. And I do want to say that we were really deliberate from draft to final to say this is the definition of a 30 by 30 conservation area, because we got so much good input that there's a lot of different shapes and forms of conservation out there. And we need to be clear that we're talking about conservation specific to this effort. So that is the conceptual definition that we landed on for 30 by 30. So where are we at right now? We think that we're about 24% of lands conserved and 16% of our coastal waters. Now, I know Nate came and talked about CA Nature last month, and so I hope he kind of went in a little bit more into the data than what I am today. But we had to really figure out how to take that conceptual definition and put it on paper and map it out to start counting. And what we feel like best met that definition, for those of you who might be familiar with the data, or if you want to go back and watch Nate's talk, is the California Protected Areas Database and the California Conservation Easement Database. Those databases sort of go down to the parcel level, and they also have sort of analysis of what they called gap code. And that just says, what types of protections are on that land to really kind of get at our conceptual definition of 30 by 30. And we felt that gap 1 and gap 2 best met our conceptual definition to sort of translate and put it on paper. We're not saying that's perfect by any means. There's definitely improvements to go, but that's our starting point and sort of how we got those numbers initially. So thinking about what does that include? Well, it includes a sort of spectrum of different types of conservation that do count in that 24%. Things like dedicated conservation areas, recreation and open spaces, working lands, watersheds and freshwater connectivity. And that one's sort of a weird one because that is included, that freshwater piece is included in the lands, but I do want to be sure to mention that it is included and it is something that's important. And I will sort of share with you later in the talk some great resources that we have to help understand sort of how it all works together, but that is included. And then for our coastal waters piece, we felt like the network of marine protected areas really sort of meets that conceptual definition. It's not included in the gap code, but we do have, I believe it's 124 MPAs that we felt really met that sort of conceptual management definition. And again, I do want to sort of bring this up, the importance of all conservation. There are many other types of conservation out there that maybe don't count for a 30 by 30 definition. Maybe they're not durably protected. Maybe they're too small to be mapped. Maybe they're not for sort of the purpose of biodiversity, but those things are all still going to be really important for 30 by 30 as a whole. So we really did elevate that up from draft to final to make sure that people understood that, there are so many ways you can do conservation. Yes, there's a bucket of what counts for 30 by 30, but we don't want to sort of discard or not care about the stuff that maybe doesn't count, but is still very, very important. So our document identifies 10 different pathways for us to get to that 30 by 30 goal. And sort of I quickly run through them. So to accelerate regionally led conservation, that's really focusing on sort of what regional plans are already out there and how can we get them implemented. There's already been so much great work put into these regional plans. We want to get them done. We want to get them funded, whatever we can do to help support them. Also recognizing that some areas still need regional plans. So how can we help sort of support those efforts to get regional plans in place? So we're really lifting up sort of local voices and what conservation is important for each area. To execute strategic land acquisitions, that's pretty straightforward. We want to get lands that count for 30 by 30. Similarly, to increase voluntary conservation easements, another way where we're not necessarily acquiring land, but we're sort of finding or putting an easement on dedicated land for 30 by 30. To enhance conservation of our existing public lands and coastal waters, and this is especially important for the coastal water pieces, recognizing that there are public lands that don't necessarily count towards that 30 by 30 goal because of the way that they're being managed. But if we could put sort of more protections or better management plans in place, or sort of change the designation of what can happen on those lands, we do think there are great opportunities to really sort of move the needle for conservation. And so one example specific to coastal waters is our national marine sanctuaries, and how can we work with our federal partners to really sort of get the management in line with our MPAs, to which we feel like it meets the definition of 30 by 30. Number 5 is to institutionalize advanced mitigation. So find opportunities to think about big conservation ahead of time so that we can really maximize the use of mitigation that's already happening throughout the state. To expand and accelerate environmental restoration and stewardship, recognizing that everywhere we can serve is not going to be sort of in the best shape. And so we really need to make sure that there's funding available and resources for restoration of the land. To strengthen coordination among our governments. So that's our tribal partners, our federal partners, making sure that we're all working together with a shared vision. Align investments to maximize conservation benefit. Similarly, making sure our government partners are working together, but also our private and philanthropy partners are working together so that we can really make our money count and kind of work together the best we can. To advance and promote complementary conservation measures. And I want to sort of say this is that thing where all conservation is important. So this is really dedicated to things that might not necessarily count for 30 by 30, but are really important. We want to make sure that they have a space and are elevated within our strategy so that we're not just sort of discounting them, but we're making resources available so that people can understand and really kind of get those connections and get those sort of other things that help but maybe don't count on the ground. And then finally, to evaluate conservation outcomes and adaptively manage. And that's really this idea that we want to make sure that what we're conserving is actually meeting those biodiversity, access, and climate goals. So we need to think about not only getting the acres sort of mapped out, but also how are we going to manage them and manage them for those goals and for the sort of forever future once they're conserved. So those are our 10 pathways, a high level overview, and I'm going to sort of get into some of the resources we have. I know Nate came to talk with your group on CA Nature, our sort of geographic information set of tools that we're really hoping our partners can utilize to help understand and see and build up their projects for conservation opportunities. So I do have some screenshots to really show you how this suite of tools and the pathways document can really sync and hopefully get you sort of quick numbers or quick sort of statistics into how your projects can really be included in 30 by 30. So if you're wondering sort of how I got to these different explorers or the underlying data, I would recommend that you go watch Nate's talk because I'm just going to quickly show you some screenshots that hopefully will kind of help you put all the pieces together. So starting off with this Conserved Areas Explorer. So I filtered it down to Orange County so that sort of I'm making it sort of local to your all's area. And you can see sort of this is what is considered conserved under our 30 by 30 definition, this gap 1 and gap 2. So if you live in Orange County and you have a project that you're thinking like for acquisition or easement, well, right now only 10.67% of Orange County sort of falls within our definition. So it took me about 30 seconds to pull this up. And that's a quick statistic that you can use to really amp up your project to say, you know, Orange County, we're only at 10%. We could use some more conservation in our area. So, you know, a quick way to sort of filter it into your area and find important numbers. Another one that I think is really great is our Biodiversity Explorer, and it lets you really look at different habitats that might be important for your area and find opportunities for conservation or talk up your projects. So here I filtered to Riverside County, and Riverside County is actually at 38.2%, which is awesome. That's above the 30% threshold like for the whole state. So great job, Riverside County, if you're on here. But you can look and see, well, there are some underrepresented habitats. So sort of this hardwood, woodland, and herbaceous areas that aren't actually sort of up at that 30%. So if you have sort of areas that you think are key that would contribute to this sort of underrepresented area, that's a great argument that even though Riverside County is at 38%, this particular habitat is underrepresented. And so we could really sort of have a boost in that. And sort of the panel on the bottom is to show statewide. So you can see that these areas are underrepresented statewide as well. So again, you can sort of talk it up, even though you're at 38%, these areas are really important and could really use some love and attention and conservation. And then lastly is the Access Explorer. And I'm a wildlife biologist, but honestly, this is probably my favorite explorer because it's sort of seeing data in a way that I never have before and sort of telling a story that I don't know any other resources to really tell versus, I do have JS experience. And so a lot of these answers I could get to myself after a while of analysis. This allows you to do it quickly. And this is a way that I actually wouldn't even know where to start on my own. So for this particular example, I filtered by Los Angeles County. And so this is just Los Angeles County as a whole and some different demographics that are within the county. So you can see that 26% of the California population lives within Los Angeles County. That's quite a bit. You can also see age distribution, education, rent versus zone, race, and household income. Really importantly, though, is if I click one button at the bottom, so right now sort of total population is clicked, but if I click gap codes 1 and 2, I can very quickly see who actually has access to nature, and that tells a totally different story. So in LA County, there's only 3% of people that live within a half a mile of a park. And what those demographics look like, I'm going to sort of switch back and forth so you can see age distribution skews up. The older generations are living closer to parks. You can see education skews up, more educated people closer to parks. You can see that housing almost flip-flops between rent and own. The demographics at the bottom, there's a lot of data in there, so you can't see, but if you sort of actually were on the application and scrolled through, you would see that it's white that sort of becomes who's living closer to parks. And finally, you can see the income where it's a little bit more spread out. Once you see who's living closer to parks, it's the wealthier. So these are, again, quick key data points that help you understand how your conservation project can fit in and really move the needle for biodiversity, climate, and access. And one last pitch for this Access Explorer is that you can actually filter it by city. So the other ones are a little bit more county, a little bit more zoomed out, but for this particular one, you can actually go all the way to city and really make comparisons even more at a local level. So our pathways document out, our tools are out to kind of help people. And now we're in this implementing phase, and it's a really exciting phase. And I hope that you all are joining us and are a part of this. So we do have our 30 by 30 partnership. We had a big kickoff event at the California Natural Resources Agency in September. And we really want this partnership group to be the vessel that sort of moves us forward and is inclusive and gets everybody sort of on the same page to achieve our 30 by 30 goal. So that includes things like government partners, community organizations, and coalitions like you all, our regional parks, our resource conservation districts, land trusts, legislators and legislative staff, students, researchers, community scientists, public and private funders, people who love nature. And if you didn't already feel included on that list, I want you to feel included because we really need all hands on deck. We're excited about this, but we know it is a big task. The sort of bubble diagram you can see on the screen, those are some sort of groups that are already made up that are really dedicated for 30 by 30 and that we're really elevating and supporting as different channels to kind of focus on through the partnership. So we do have the Biodiversity Council, which brings together our local, state, federal government as a sort of government place to discuss. Our Biodiversity Network, which is researchers from across the state focused on science. Our tribal partners, this is really run by our Assistant Secretary, Geneva Thompson, for Tribal Affairs, who really has a space for our tribal partners to come and provide input in a dedicated funding source. Our Ocean Protection Council, which is really focused on the coastal waters piece piece. And finally, our regional working groups and coalitions, making sure that this is a locally led effort and that we're supporting them as much as we possibly can. So a sneak peek as to what's to come for 2023. Well, we're implementing our pathways document, as I said, and that's really what we're going to be focused on in 2023. So we were very lucky to have a good amount of funding that came through in the budget last year. So that's really going to be our focus, is getting that money spent, which is why we want your projects to be successful in that. Resources, anything that we can do to help clarify. And I'm going to show some specific examples that just went up on our website last month, and then facilitating connections. And we do plan to continue our engagement. We know that that public input was really key in our strategy, and we're going to continue that through webinars, local meetings, and field trips. We're going to launch a newsletter. We've already launched a blog that's on our website. We're going to have an annual report on how we're doing, and we're going to have another 30 by 30 partnership event. That's going to be an annual event, hopefully, that will move throughout the state. So a lot of this is on our website, www.californianature.ca.gov. I hope you all are familiar with it, but if you aren't, please do explore it. Some of the new things I just want to show you all that are there now is we have this new resources tab, and it has a specific section on funding opportunities and topical summaries. So for the funding opportunities, you can see the money that was dedicated to 30 by 30 in the state budget this year. And then in the fall, we actually hosted a virtual expo series where we brought all of our partners together who received money in our budget to have a conversation with Jen on how our partners can apply and sort of what they can look for in projects. So if you haven't already, I would recommend you sort of go back and look at those that might be relevant to you. They're all sort of YouTube videos, and they're bite-sized. They're like 30 minutes, and it's 2 agencies video. We also have these new topical summaries, and those are for sort of key areas where people still had confusion or wondering sort of how it all fits together, because a lot of it was spread throughout our document. And so we wanted to bring it together all in one place. So for example, freshwater, for people who might be confused at how freshwater fits in, because it is sort of spread throughout our document, you can find a one-pager that specifically goes through how it fits in and sort of brings it all together. And we have several sort of topics as well as educational resources. And then I want to give a plug that we are having our very first webinar for the year. It's going to highlight sort of some things from 2022 and really focus on what's to come. And so that is happening next week, next Tuesday, January 31st, from 10:30 to 11:45. You can register for that on our website. And if you can't make that date, I'm sure the recording will be on our website shortly thereafter. So do look out for that. Website, one last time, if you couldn't tell already, super important. That's where you'll find a lot of information. And I just want to say thank you for having me here. Again, we really want to support and uplift our sort of regional coalitions and working groups. So however we can be helpful, we're happy to kind of step in. And this is how you can reach me directly. If you have any clarifying questions or things you want to discuss, that's my email. So that's the end of my presentation, Melanie. I can stop sharing my screen.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was what was really important, I think, to hear was how to use the mapping tools to advocate for your project in applications. So thank you for doing that. We do have some of the pre-submitted questions. So let me start with those. And if you want, you can go ahead and type some into the chat and we'll see if we can get to them. The first one is from Marcia, who's in the Southland Coalition. The question is, how are concerns related to the current management by state agencies being melded into the 30 by 30 program? And there's an example of whether or not state agencies are managing lands according to the 30 by 30 goals or not.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I think that we do have a pathway specific to sort of management and adaptive management and monitoring. And so we are using sort of those pieces of strategy. It's pathway number 10 to really sort of look for opportunities on state lands or others as well, whether it's through funding or sort of actually working with our partners to kind of boost this management. And I will say this is difficult because it's not a one-time funding thing, it's an ongoing funding thing. And those conversations are are much more difficult than buying a bunch of land right now, because you can get the money one time. So they are our ongoing conversations. We are working closely in the Biodiversity Council with our state and federal agencies on management, and then also looking for creative solutions with funding agencies for management of not only state lands, but other people who might be applying for funding as well. So there's a lot of work to do for sure. We're having those conversations, figuring out the best way, but we do recognize that that's really important because, you know, as a state, if we're talking 30 by 30, we want to make sure our lands are actually being managed for 30 by 30, but we have to make sure the funds are there for sure.
Absolutely. Great. Next question is from Anupa from NRDC. Are new MPAs being considered as a pathway for 30 by 30 in the ocean?
That's a great question. So at this point, there isn't sort of a framework in place for considering new MPAs. I will say that the MPA Decadal Management Review just came out. It just hit the streets on CFW's website, and I can share a link if that's helpful. And it's going to be presented at the Fish and Game Commission on February 8th or 9th. I'd have to look at their agenda. But that's sort of overview of how they've done in the first 10 years and really kind of provide some science and recommendations for moving forward. So I think we're going to be taking a hard look at that, working with the Ocean Protection Council on what's next, and whether that's sort of developing a framework, or whether it's, you know, one of the ways they presented opportunities was working with NOAA, and it's probably going to be all of the above approach, but that decadal management review will really inform kind of how we move forward, but we haven't quite got there yet.
Excellent. And so the February meeting is the announcement of the draft that's coming out. Did I hear that correctly?
I believe it's the final that's out.
Oh, the final. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I missed the draft then. All right.
Yeah, and the document is out, like you can look at it ahead of time and sort of become familiar with it before the Fish and Game Commission meeting, but that is sort of where it will be formally presented.
Okay, and are comments still being accepted on it?
I'm not sure if it is comments. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Same person asking this question: what is the state considering to broaden outreach and communication for the public to get involved in the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is one of sort of the key things that we're thinking about for 2023, because we do want this to be a movement, right? We really want to build this movement. And so we're going to be hosting events. We're going to continue with that public input, whether it's webinars, the upcoming webinar on the 31st, it is going to have sort of a live feedback. We are going to bring back the poll everywhere and ask people questions. So that will be interactive as a way for us to kind of check in and hear about what went really well for you and how can we improve. So I do think it's sort of us hosting events, but also really leveraging our partners, including the Partnership Coordinating Committee, to say, okay, how can we get out there more? How can we see different areas, talk to different partners? Because again, we're building this movement. And so we know that we need that input and we need people on board. We're launching a new newsletter, new blog, hopefully new social media soon. So again, we're really trying to get a coordinated effort in place to build a movement. And I do expect that will have a lot of public input, because that has been so important. And so we want to make sure that those channels continue moving forward.
Great. Yeah, a lot of involvement based on the numbers you were using earlier. Thank you. Question from Carrie Tully with California Salmon. What are the tribes' roles currently and in the future, and what kind of outreach has been conducted to all the tribes in the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is one of our core commitments, strengthening our tribal partnerships, and we're very lucky to have Geneva Thompson, who's our Assistant Secretary for Tribal Affairs at California Natural Resources Agency, who's really helped us and has been leading this effort with our tribes. So from the start, as soon as the executive order went out, I think in January, they started sort of formal tribal consultations. And there were also listening sessions that happened, which were less formal than a, official consultation, but we just wanted to have a space, a dedicated space where Native American tribes could come to the table and sort of give feedback. So whether it's formal or a little bit more informal, we have made sure that there has been dedicated space. There was a set aside in our budget, $70 million for this year, specific for tribal nature-based solutions. And again, Geneva has really been working on sort of the consultation portion and getting those guidelines sort of created, and hopefully we'll hit the streets soon. But we did hear a lot of feedback that there needs to be a dedicated spot for our California Native American tribes, because it's difficult to compete for funding, for space, things like that. So we do have some dedicated channels, but we hope that it really can be sort of integrated throughout. Not just they're over here and we're over here, but we really find ways to collaborate. So, we're actively working on resources to make it collaborative, but there is a space and they do have an important voice at the table.
Great, that sounds quite important, and I'm glad the state's investing the time in that. One more question. I think we may have time for one after this. How can the state work with federal agencies to enhance abandoned land owned by them? And the example is boar. And the question comes from Ray at the Leap Institute.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do have the Biodiversity Council, which is our sort of dedicated space to bring together our state and federal agencies. And so we do look for opportunities like that and how we can sort of come together and work together between that state federal sort of silo. But, specific examples like that, there's a lot of complex issues that I'm not aware of, so many people, so many moving parts. And so, when there are opportunities like that, support from the community is always helpful for us to know your perspective. We'll hear the perspective of our sort of federal counterparts, and then really how can we be a support in that? Where are there opportunities for us to have conversations, to write letters, to have a meeting? We're looking for opportunities like that. So, hearing them from different channels is always very helpful, and really kind of helps elevate those things. So
great. So our last question, and I'm going to ask everyone, we're going to be doing a group photo here at the end. So if you can go ahead and turn your videos on, getting ready for that while I do the last question. This one's from Sharon Musa at the Wilderness Society. The question is, how can we more effectively connect the state 30 by 30 programs and directives to the local parks need in LA County, particularly around the updated Parks Needs Plus report from 2022?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And shout out to Sharon, who's also on our partnership coordinating committee. We read through that report, and we really love to see how sort of they took our statewide strategy and then really sort of zoomed in and sort of what made sense for LA County. So there was a big focus on sort of what equity looks like in LA County, which is great, and a big focus on restoration, because for them, that's sort of a huge focus there. So we had a meeting recently with LA County Parks, which is great to kind of hear their insights and what they wanted sort of next steps to be for working together. So I think continuing to have those meetings and look for opportunities for how can we get you plugged into our funding? How can we have the conversation? We really want to elevate that report, because again, it's a great example of sort of making our sort of statewide thing local. We want to elevate those voices. So I think there's a lot of opportunities between getting projects on the ground and being a part of our movement, and just showing people how this could be a great example. So I hope there are good next steps that come from that. We do have we're hoping to have an in-person meeting with them soon. And yeah, I think there will be a lot of opportunities.
Great, thank you. All right, last call for everyone to turn on their videos. Otherwise, it might just be your name showing up. So Haiti's going to be the one that does the screen capture. Are you ready, Haiti?
I am ready. I see some folks are turning their cameras on, so I'm going to wait 1 second. Perfect. All right, everybody smile. Awesome. Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, we have one more. Do it. Join in. Do it one more time.
One more time. All right. Ready? Smile, everybody. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. So Madeline, thank you so much for attending today. We are going to be posting this to YouTube. So if you have questions, need to watch it again, you can. If somebody you know missed it, then they can watch it later on. Thank you again. And we appreciate your time, CNRA's time. And anyone that wants to stay on, I'll answer the 2 questions in the chat, and then we're going to hop straight into the Southland agenda. Thank you, Madeline.
Thank you all, and thank you all for your great work. We're really thankful to have this group be a part of the movement.
Perfect. Thanks. Take care.
Y'all too.
So there's a question in the chat about renewable energy projects in the desert and how 30 by 30 can reconcile those competing interests, or is it even possible? I think it's going to depend on who you ask. I know that they're looking at doing advanced mitigation out in the desert, which is one of the pathways to 30 by 30. So it allows infrastructure projects to move forward while at the same time conserving land. Depending on who you ask, that may or may not be a good idea. For example, it might be a better idea to put solar on top of rooftops instead of using our natural lands. So just throwing ideas out there. And then the last question, I think I saw federal lands in 30 by 30 being counted. Yes, federal lands are counted. You can see that in the CA Nature mapping tools, as long as they're a GAP 1 or GAP 2 conserved location. So thank you everyone for coming. If you are with the Southland, I encourage you to stay on. We have a couple more things to cover, and I appreciate everyone's time. And I'm going to go ahead and allow my Southland group to unmute themselves so that we can get going in our meeting.